For 23 years, Officer James Sullivan knew exactly who the good guys and bad guys were. His badge was his identity, his judgment was his shield, and the lines between right and wrong were carved in stone. Until the day a 16-year-old girl in a worn Howard University sweatshirt shattered his world with 7 words that would change everything. "I need you to really see me, officer." Officer James Sullivan sat in his patrol car, drumming his fingers against the steering wheel as rain pelted the windshield. 23 years on the force had left deep lines around his eyes and a perpetual furrow in his brow. The coffee in his cup holder had gone cold hours ago, forgotten during another long shift in the south side of Chicago. His radio crackled with reports of minor disturbances, a noise complaint here, a parking violation there. But Sullivan's mind kept drifting back to last week's departmental review. The words of his superior still stung. "Your arrest record shows a concerning pattern, Sullivan. We're seeing disproportionate numbers in certain demographics." He'd stormed out of that meeting, face burning. 3 generations of his family had worn the badge. His father had walked these same streets, as had his grandfather before him. They'd raised him on stories of serve and protect, of maintaining order in a chaotic world. He knew who the troublemakers were. He knew what neighborhoods to watch. That wasn't bias, that was experience. The dispatch radio interrupted his brooding. Reports of suspicious activity at Wilson's Corner store, possible shoplifting in progress. Sullivan straightened up, muscle memory taking over, as he flipped on his lights. Wilson's was just around the corner. Old man Charlie Wilson had been running that place since Sullivan was a rookie. Good man, straight shooter. The store's fluorescent lights buzzed harshly as Sullivan pushed through the glass door, bell chiming overhead. Charlie stood behind the counter, face tight with concern, gesturing toward the back of the store. "Young girl," Charlie whispered. "Been wandering the aisles for 20 minutes. Keeps putting things in her backpack when she thinks I'm not looking." Sullivan nodded, already scanning the store. He spotted her in the canned goods aisle. Couldn't have been more than 16, wearing a worn Howard University sweatshirt that was a few sizes too big. Her hair was pulled back in neat braids, and she was studying the nutrition label on a can of beans with intense concentration. Something about her posture made Sullivan pause. There was a tension in her shoulders, a careful deliberateness to her movements that spoke of someone trying very hard to appear casual. His hand instinctively moved to rest on his holster, a habit born of countless similar situations. "Miss," he called out, using his authoritative voice, "I'm going to need you to place that bag on the ground and step away." The girl turned slowly, and Sullivan saw something flash across her face. Not guilt or defiance, but a bone-deep weariness that seemed out of place on someone so young. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, neither of them moved. "Officer," she said quietly, "my name is Tamara Washington. I'm 16 years old. I'm in the advanced placement program at Lincoln High. I have 3 younger siblings at home, and our mom is working her second shift at the hospital right now." Sullivan felt his jaw tighten. He had heard every excuse in the book over the years. "That's not relevant to—" "I'm telling you who I am," Tamara continued, her voice steady but her hands trembling slightly, "because I need you to see me, really see me, not just what you expect to see when you walk into a store and somebody points at a black girl in the back aisle." Sullivan's hand gripped his holster tighter. "Empty the bag." Tamara slowly unzipped her backpack. Inside were textbooks, notebooks, and a graphing calculator, and yes, several cans of food, but also a crumpled receipt from the self-checkout machine. "I paid for everything," she said softly. "I always do. But you didn't ask that first, did you? You didn't ask if I had a receipt. You didn't ask why I was here. You just saw what you expected to see." Charlie Wilson had come around the counter now, peering at the receipt Tamara held out. His face flushed with embarrassment. I guess I jumped to conclusions. I'm sorry, miss." But Tamara's eyes stayed locked on Sullivan's. "My dad was a police officer too," she said. "He died in the line of duty when I was 8. He used to tell me that the badge meant something, that it meant protecting everyone, not just some people. He said it meant seeing the whole picture, not just the frame we're used to looking through." Sullivan felt something shift in his chest, a hairline crack in a foundation he'd thought was solid. But years of training and ingrained responses warred with this new uncertainty. He opened his mouth to respond. "Your father," Sullivan said, his voice rougher than he intended. What was his name? Marcus Washington, Tamara replied. He worked the 15th District. Sullivan's hand dropped from his holster as if it had suddenly turned hot. Marcus Washington. The name hit him like a physical blow. He remembered the funeral. 8 years ago, the whole department had turned out. Washington had taken a bullet protecting a convenience store clerk during an armed robbery. Sullivan had been there that day, 2 precincts over, when the call came through. I knew your father, Sullivan managed. He was a good cop. He was a great cop, Tamara corrected, still holding his gaze. Because he never forgot that. Behind every situation, there's a story. There are reasons, there's context. She gestured to her backpack. You want to know why I was taking so long in here? Why I was reading every label? Because we're on food stamps, and I have to make every dollar stretch. My little brother Tommy has celiac disease. Do you know how expensive gluten-free food is? So I stand here and I calculate protein per dollar, and I try to figure out how to keep everyone fed until Mom's next paycheck. Sullivan felt the familiar certainty of his world tilting sideways. He thought of his own daughters at home, how he'd never once had to worry about them having enough to eat, how they'd never had to become mathematicians just to buy groceries. Charlie Wilson had moved closer, his earlier suspicion replaced by shame. Listen, miss, I've got some gluten-free items in the back that are close to expiration. Can't sell them at full price anyway. They're yours if you want them. But Tamara shook her head. I don't want charity. I just want... She paused, taking a deep breath. I want what my dad died fighting for. A world where people look at each other and see human beings first. Where a girl can buy groceries for her family without being treated like a criminal. Sullivan found himself looking around the store with new eyes. The security cameras his friend Charlie had installed last year aimed primarily at certain aisles. The signs warning about shoplifting positioned strategically near the front, where certain customers would be sure to see them. How many times had he responded to calls here? How many times had he walked in already knowing who he was looking for? Your father, Sullivan said slowly. He used to say something. At roll call, he'd always remind us. The badge is a bridge, not a barrier, Tamara finished. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. He said it every morning before he left for work. It was the last thing he said to me that day. Outside, the rain had gotten heavier, drumming against the store's windows. Sullivan could hear his radio crackling with another call, but for the first time in his career, he let it go. Something more important was happening here. Tell me about Tommy, he said finally. Your brother. What grade is he in? Tamara blinked, surprised by the shift. 4th grade. He wants to be a scientist. He's got this whole notebook full of experiments he wants to try, but... She gestured at her carefully selected groceries. Sometimes we have to choose between buying ingredients for his science projects and buying dinner. Charlie Wilson disappeared into the back of the store, returning with a box of unsold inventory. Sullivan watched as his old friend began pulling out gluten-free items, checking expiration dates. The store owner's hands were shaking slightly. You said your mom's working a second shift? Sullivan asked, his mind racing through department programs he'd ignored for years. At which hospital? Mercy General, Tamara replied. She's a nursing assistant, trying to save up for nursing school, but... She shrugged, that too-old weariness settling back onto her young shoulders. Sullivan pulled out his notebook, not to write a citation, but for something else entirely. He thought about his own precinct's community outreach program, the one he'd dismissed as political correctness gone too far. About the educational fund for children of fallen officers that he'd never bothered to mention to families who might need it. About all the assumptions he'd made, all the bridges he'd failed to build. Listen, Sullivan said, tearing a page from his notebook. There's a program at the precinct for families of officers who died in the line of duty. Educational support, mentorship, that kind of thing. Your dad's sacrifice, it means something to us. It should have meant more, sooner. He began writing down names and numbers, his pen pressing hard against the paper. This is Margaret Chen in Community Services. She runs the scholarship program. And this, he added another number, this is my direct line, not dispatch. Me. Tamara took the paper carefully, as if unsure whether to trust this sudden shift. Why are you doing this now? It was a fair question, more than fair. Sullivan felt the weight of it, heavier than his badge. Because your father was right. About the badge being a bridge, and I've been treating it like a wall for too long. Charlie Wilson cleared his throat. I've got a position open here at the store, he said. Part-time, after school, pays above minimum wage. If you're interested, Tamara. Sullivan watched the interplay of emotions across Tamara's face, hope warring with pride, need battling with dignity. He recognized that struggle now, seeing it through new eyes. The food bank at First Presbyterian, he found himself saying. They do gluten-free boxes now, no questions asked, and they're always looking for volunteers. Looks good on college applications. He paused. I know because my wife helps out there. She'd love to meet you and Tommy. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a steady hum that seemed to fill the silence as Tamara processed everything. Outside, the world continued its usual rhythm, cars splashing through puddles, sirens wailing in the distance, the city breathing its familiar breath. But in here, something was changing. My dad, Tamara said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. He used to say that change happens one heart at a time. That's why he became a cop, to change things from the inside. She looked down at the paper in her hands, then back up at Sullivan. He would have been happy to know his death wasn't for nothing, that it's still changing things. Sullivan felt the truth of that hit him like a physical force. How many Marcus Washingtons had there been? How many Tamaras? How many chances to build bridges had he missed, thinking he was protecting something when he was really just building walls? His radio crackled again. Another call, another situation waiting to be judged and handled. But this time, as he reached for it, he found himself wondering about the stories behind the static, about the contexts he'd never bothered to consider. Mr. Wilson, Tamara said, turning to the store owner. About that job? What hours were you thinking? Charlie brightened. Well, we could work around your school schedule. Maybe start you at the register. Though, with your math skills, I might need you helping with inventory. As they discussed details, Sullivan's phone buzzed, a text from his wife. Bringing the girls to the food bank tomorrow. Want to join? He looked at Tamara, now smiling for the first time since he'd entered the store, as she and Charlie worked out a schedule. He thought about Tommy, the young scientist, and wondered if his oldest daughter might be willing to part with her old chemistry set. He thought about Marcus Washington, about bridges and barriers, about changes that happen one heart at a time. I've got another call, he said, holding up his radio. But, Tamara, I'm here Wednesday mornings. That's when I do my coffee run. He gestured to the store's small coffee counter. Maybe we could talk more about that scholarship program, and about your dad. Tamara nodded, understanding passing between them. Wednesday mornings, she repeated. I'll bring Tommy's science notebook. Maybe you could help us figure out which experiments won't break the grocery budget. As Sullivan pushed through the store's door, back into the rain, he felt different. The weight of his badge was the same, but its meaning had shifted. He thought about all the calls he'd responded to over the years, all the snap judgments, all the bridges unbuilt. His radio crackled once more. Possible disturbance at 47th and King Drive. Sullivan sat in his patrol car, finger hovering over the radio button. 47th and King Drive. He knew that intersection well. Too well, maybe. How many times had he rolled up there, lights flashing, mind already made up about what he'd find? Copy that, he said finally. En route. As he drove, his conversation with Tamara echoed in his mind. He thought about his own daughters, Katie, 15, and Sarah, 12. How would they handle what Tamara dealt with every day? The responsibility, the careful calculations, the weight of others' assumptions. The disturbance turned out to be a group of teenagers outside the community center. As Sullivan pulled up, he saw something that, just an hour ago, would have immediately set off his alarms. 5 young men, hoodies up despite the warm evening, gathered around a phone. But now he forced himself to pause, to look closer. They were watching something on the screen, taking turns with elaborate hand movements. As he stepped out of his car, he could hear their excited voices. Nah, man, you gotta keep your wrists loose like this. That ain't what the tutorial said. Sullivan recognized what they were doing now, learning dance moves from a video. He'd seen Katie doing the same thing in their living room countless times. One of the teens spotted him and immediately stiffened. The others followed suit, their easy laughter evaporating. Sullivan felt the familiar tension descend. the unspoken history of 1,000 similar encounters hanging in the air. "Evening," he said, consciously keeping his hands away from his belt. "Community center's closing soon?" "Yes, sir," one of the young men replied quickly, too quickly. "We were just leaving." "That's some complicated choreography you're working on," Sullivan said, surprising himself as much as them. "My daughter's been trying to learn that one too. What do you call it? The shuffle step?" The teenagers exchanged glances, clearly thrown by this unexpected turn in the script. "Running Man Evolution," the tallest one said finally. "It's for the talent show next week, at the center," he added hurriedly, as if afraid Sullivan would assume something else. Sullivan nodded, thinking of Tamara's words about seeing the whole picture. "You know," he said slowly, "they're starting a new youth program at the precinct, looking for performers for the launch event, paid gig." He saw the skepticism in their faces, the disbelief that a cop, especially this cop, would be offering them an opportunity rather than a warning. "For real?" asked one of the younger ones, earning an elbow from his friend. "For real," Sullivan confirmed, reaching for his notebook again. He wrote down the details, along with his name and number. "Ask for Officer Chen. She's running it. Tell her Sullivan sent you." As he handed over the paper, he saw something shift in their expressions. Not trust exactly. That would take more than one conversation to build, but perhaps the beginning of possibility. "Thanks, officer," said the tall one, carefully folding the paper into his pocket. Back in his car, Sullivan pulled out his phone and fired off a text to Margaret Chen. "Got some talented kids for your youth program, dancers. We'll send them your way." Her reply came quickly. "Since when do you recruit for community programs?" Sullivan stared at the message for a long moment. Since when, indeed? He thought about Tamara, about Marcus Washington's legacy, about bridges and barriers. "Since today," he typed back. The rest of his shift passed differently than usual. At each call, each interaction, he found himself pausing, looking for the story behind the situation, thinking about context. Near midnight, he pulled into his driveway, bone-tired but restless with thoughts. The house was dark except for the kitchen light. Sarah must have left it on for him again. As he hung up his badge and gun, his eyes fell on a family photo on the wall. Him in his dress blues at last year's department ceremony. Katie and Sarah flanking him proudly. He took out his phone one last time. "Hey Charlie," he typed to the store owner. "That gluten-free stuff you mentioned? What else do you have trouble selling? Might know some families who could use it. Happy to pay cost." Then another text, this one to his wife. "Count me in for the food bank tomorrow. And honey, think Katie would be interested in tutoring some kids in math, paid position, got some families in mind." The kitchen light cast a warm glow as he made his way upstairs. Tomorrow would bring new calls, new situations, new chances to either build bridges or reinforce walls. For the first time in years, he found himself looking forward to the challenge. His phone buzzed one last time, a message from an unknown number. "This is Tamara. Thank you for today. Tommy wants to know if you really want to see his science notebook." Sullivan smiled in the darkness of his hallway, thinking about bridges being built, one conversation at a time. The next morning, Sullivan arrived at the precinct earlier than usual. The night shift was just wrapping up, tired officers filing out as he made his way to his desk. He noticed things he'd overlooked before, the way some of his colleagues tensed when certain types of people walked past the front desk, the subtle shifts in tone during different encounters. "Sullivan!" Margaret Chen's voice caught his attention. She was standing in the doorway of her office, coffee cup in hand. "Got a minute?" Inside her office, surrounded by community outreach posters and youth program flyers, Chen fixed him with a curious look. "So, these dancers you mentioned, this wouldn't have anything to do with the call you took at Wilson's yesterday?" Sullivan shifted in his chair. "Different situation, but related thinking, maybe." Chen nodded slowly. "You know, in the 8 years I've been running these programs, this is the first time you've shown interest." She paused. "What changed?" Sullivan thought about how to answer. About Marcus Washington's daughter and all she'd taught him in one brief encounter. About bridges and barriers. About seeing the whole picture. "Met someone who reminded me why I became a cop in the first place," he said finally. Before Chen could respond, Sullivan's radio crackled. A domestic disturbance call, not far from Wilson's store. As he stood to leave, Chen held out a stack of brochures. Youth programs, scholarship information, community resources, she explained, since you're apparently in the bridge building business now. The domestic disturbance turned out to be more complicated than the initial call suggested. A teenage boy, Marcus Thompson, had gotten into a fight with his mother's boyfriend. When Sullivan arrived, he found the boy sitting on the front steps, nursing a split lip. "He hit my mom," Marcus said before Sullivan could ask anything. "I got between them." In the past, Sullivan might have seen this as a straightforward case. Aggressive teenager, domestic violence, clear protocol to follow. But now he heard Tamara's voice in his head. Behind every situation, there's a story. He sat down on the steps next to Marcus, maintaining a careful distance. "Tell me what happened, the whole story." Over the next 20 minutes, the story emerged. Marcus was a junior at Lincoln High, the same school as Tamara. His mother's boyfriend had moved in 3 months ago. Things had been okay at first, but then the man lost his job, started drinking, started taking his frustrations out on Marcus's mother. "I tried to get her to leave," Marcus said, his voice cracking, "but we got nowhere else to go, and she's scared about making rent on her own." Sullivan thought about the resource brochures in his car, about the domestic violence shelter contacts he'd accumulated over the years, but rarely shared, assuming people already knew about them, or wouldn't use them anyway. "Your mom," he said carefully, "what does she do for work?" "She's a nurse at Mercy General," Marcus replied. Sullivan felt a jolt of recognition. "Night shift?" Marcus nodded. "Does she know Melissa Washington, nursing assistant?" Another nod. "Yeah, they work together sometimes. How'd you know?" Sullivan pulled out his phone, scrolling to Tamara's number from the night before. "I met someone yesterday who might be able to help. Her mom works with yours, and—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "She taught me something about looking at the whole picture, about finding solutions instead of just responding to problems." He called Chen first, then the domestic violence advocate he knew. Within an hour, Marcus and his mother had a safe place to go, resources to help them start over, and, perhaps most importantly, a plan. As he helped them gather their belongings, Sullivan noticed a familiar-looking sweatshirt in Marcus's room. Howard University. "You know Tamara Washington?" he asked. Marcus's face brightened slightly, despite his split lip. "Yeah, we're in AP Calc together. She helps me sometimes when I'm struggling. She's crazy smart." Sullivan thought about the threads connecting everything. Marcus and Tamara, their mothers working the same hospital shifts. The shared dreams represented by that Howard sweatshirt. The cycles of violence and poverty and misunderstanding that affected them all. His phone buzzed. A text from his wife about the food bank visit later. Another from Charlie Wilson. "Got those kids you sent over, starting them next week. Good kids." And finally, one from Tamara. "Tommy's excited about Wednesday. He wants to know if you like volcanoes." Sullivan smiled, thinking about baking soda and vinegar experiments, about chemical reactions and chain reactions, about how change really does happen one heart at a time. By Wednesday morning, word had spread through the precinct about Sullivan's apparent transformation. Some officers watched him with curiosity, others with skepticism. Sergeant Martinez had pulled him aside yesterday, concern evident in his voice. "Look, Sullivan," he'd said, "I hear you're getting pretty involved in Chen's community programs. That's great, but don't lose sight of who you are. We can't save everyone." Those words echoed in Sullivan's mind as he pulled into Wilson's parking lot. Who he was. 23 years on the force had defined him in certain ways, shaped his perspectives, hardened some edges. But now he wondered, had that been growth or calcification? The bell chimed as he entered the store. Charlie was behind the counter, but he wasn't alone. Tamara was there, wearing a brand new store apron, carefully arranging a display of gluten-free snacks. Beside her stood a small boy with thick glasses and a NASA t-shirt. Tommy, Sullivan presumed. "Officer Sullivan!" Tommy's face lit up. "Tamara said you wanted to see my experiments." Sullivan found himself smiling at the boy's enthusiasm. "I sure do, buddy. But first..." He reached into his car and pulled out a worn cardboard box. "My daughter Katie wanted you to have this. It's her old chemistry set. She's more into dance these days." Tommy's eyes widened behind his glasses as he opened the box, revealing beakers, test tubes, and various safe chemicals. "Really? I can have this?" "On one condition," Sullivan said seriously. You have to promise to only use it with adult supervision. And maybe you could show me some of your experiments sometime?" As Tommy excitedly pulled out his notebook, Sullivan noticed someone else entering the store, Marcus Thompson, his split lip healing, but still visible. The boy hesitated when he saw Sullivan, but Tamara waved him over. "Marcus, you're early for your shift," she said, then turned to Sullivan. "Mr. Wilson hired him too. He's going to help with inventory and stocking." Sullivan watched as Marcus relaxed slightly, moving to help Tamara with the display. There was something profound in this simple scene. Two teenagers who society often viewed with suspicion, carefully arranging products in a store where, just days ago, one of them had been suspected of theft. "Officer Sullivan," Tommy's voice brought him back to the present. "Want to see my volcano design? I figured out how to make the lava different colors." As Tommy excitedly explained his modifications to the classic baking soda and vinegar experiment, Sullivan's radio crackled, a shoplifting call 3 blocks away. His hand moved toward the radio, but he paused. "What's wrong?" Tommy asked, looking up from his notebook. Sullivan thought about what Tamara had said about seeing the whole picture, about context and stories. "Nothing's wrong," he said, "just thinking about how sometimes things aren't what they seem at first glance." He keyed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Sullivan. I'm nearby at Wilson's. Before responding, can you get more details about the situation? Ask about context." The dispatcher's pause was noticeable. Sullivan rarely asked for more information before responding. "Copy that, Sullivan. Stand by." While waiting, he turned back to Tommy's notebook. The boy had drawn elaborate diagrams of his planned experiments, complete with hypotheses and variables to test. His enthusiasm was infectious, reminding Sullivan of Katie at that age, before she'd started seeing the world through the lens of others' expectations. "Dispatch to Sullivan," his radio crackled. "Update on that shoplifting call. Store manager says it's a young mother with 2 kids, trying to take baby formula and diapers." Sullivan closed his eyes for a moment. A week ago, he would have responded immediately, seeing only the crime, not the desperation behind it. "Copy that. Tell them I'm responding, but also get Chen on the line. We may need resources more than handcuffs." He looked at Tommy apologetically. "I've got to go, buddy, but save that volcano experiment for me, okay? Maybe we can try it next Wednesday?" Tommy nodded eagerly. "I'll make it extra special, with 3 different colors." As Sullivan headed for the door, Tamara called out, "Officer Sullivan, remember what my dad used to say?" He turned back, meeting her eyes. "The badge is a bridge, not a barrier." She smiled. "And bridges work both ways." Driving toward his call, Sullivan thought about bridges and connections, about Tommy's experiments and Marcus's split lip and Tamara's careful calculations, about how change happens one heart at a time, but those changes ripple outward in ways we can't always predict. The young mother's name was Angela Rivera. Sullivan found her sitting on a curb outside the drugstore, holding a crying infant while a toddler clutched her leg. Her eyes were red, her shoulders slumped in defeat. The store manager hovered nearby, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Ma'am," Sullivan said, approaching slowly, "I'm Officer Sullivan. Can we talk about what's happening here?" Angela looked up, fear flickering across her face. I can put everything back. Please, I didn't know what else to do." Sullivan sat down on the curb, leaving space between them. "Tell me about your situation, the whole story." It spilled out then. Her husband's deportation 6 months ago, the lost income, the endless bureaucracy of applying for assistance. She'd been stretching formula by diluting it, but the baby's doctor had warned her to stop. She'd been skipping meals herself to buy diapers, but this week, she'd had to choose between paying the electric bill and buying essentials for her children. "I've never stolen anything before," she whispered. The baby was crying, and I didn't have enough." Sullivan thought about his own daughters again, about how he'd never had to choose between keeping their lights on and keeping them fed. He reached for his phone. "Margaret, it's Sullivan. Remember that emergency assistance fund you mentioned? Yeah, I've got someone who needs it. And those formula samples from the community health fair, can you bring them?" While they waited, Sullivan turned to the store manager. "How much was the total for what she tried to take?" The manager shifted uncomfortably. $43.27. Sullivan pulled out his wallet. "I'm paying for it, and..." He paused, thinking of Tamara's careful calculations at Wilson's. What other baby supplies do you have close to expiration? Items you'd have to mark down anyway? 20 minutes later, Chen arrived with resources, contacts, and immediate assistance. As they helped Angela load supplies into her old car, Sullivan noticed her toddler watching him with wide eyes. "What's your name, buddy?" he asked, kneeling down. "Miguel," the boy whispered. "You know what, Miguel? I bet you'd like my friend Tommy. He's about your age, and he does these amazing science experiments." By the time Sullivan returned to the precinct, the story had already made the rounds. Officer Davis caught him in the parking lot. "Hey, Sullivan," Davis called out. "Heard you're running a charity now, instead of making arrests." Sullivan thought carefully before responding. "You know, Davis, I've been thinking about something Marcus Washington used to say. The fallen officer? What's he got to do with this?" His daughter reminded me recently that every situation has a story. Sometimes the best way to protect and serve is to understand that story first. Davis scoffed. "Yeah? And how many criminals are you letting walk with that philosophy?" "Actually," came Chen's voice from behind them, "Sullivan's community referrals have led to 3 domestic violence interventions this week alone, 2 families in emergency housing. And that mother today, turns out she's eligible for multiple assistance programs, but nobody ever told her. Sometimes preventing crime is more effective than punishing it." Later that evening, Sullivan sat in his patrol car completing paperwork. His phone buzzed with a text from Tamara. "Tommy won't stop talking about the chemistry set. Says he's going to cure cancer someday." Another message popped up, this one from Charlie Wilson. "Remember that shoplifting problem we used to have? Down 50% since we started the youth employment program. Who knew?" And finally, a message from his wife. "Katie asked about volunteering at the food bank with me. Says she wants to understand what you've been up to lately." Sullivan smiled, thinking about bridges being built in unexpected places. His radio crackled with another call, but this time, he didn't feel the old familiar tension. Instead, he felt curiosity about what story he might find, what bridge he might help build. 1 month later, Sullivan stood in the community center gymnasium watching a group of teenagers perform their dance routine. The same kids he'd encountered practicing outside weeks ago were now commanding the stage at the precinct's youth program launch event. In the audience, he spotted Tamara with Tommy, who was excitedly showing his notebook to Katie. Marcus Thompson was there too, his mother sitting proudly beside him. They'd moved into their own apartment now, with help from the Domestic Violence Support Network. Marcus had started teaching basic dance moves to younger kids at the community center on weekends. Angela Rivera sat a few rows back, her children clean and well-fed. She'd found work as a translator for the precinct's community outreach program, Chen's idea. Miguel had indeed become fast friends with Tommy, united by their shared love of making messes in the name of science. The dancers finished their routine to thunderous applause. Sullivan noticed several of his fellow officers watching with surprised appreciation. Sergeant Martinez leaned over to whisper, "Maybe you were on to something, Sullivan." After the performance, Sullivan made his way through the crowd. Charlie Wilson was there, having closed the store early so his young employees could attend. "Shoplifting's down 70% now," he reported proudly. "And sales are up. Turns out when people feel respected, they respect you back." "Officer Sullivan!" Tommy came running up, notebook in hand. "Can I show everyone my volcano experiment? Please, I got all 3 colors working." Before Sullivan could answer, Tamara appeared beside them. "Actually," she said, "we thought maybe we could do the experiment together. Show everyone how science and law enforcement can work together to understand how things work." Sullivan looked at her questioningly. "My dad used to say that understanding is like a chemical reaction," she explained. "Put the right elements together, and something new is created, something better." They set up Tommy's volcano on a table at the front of the gym. As Sullivan helped the boy measure the ingredients, he saw Davis and some other skeptical officers drift closer, drawn by Tommy's infectious enthusiasm. "See," Tommy explained to the growing crowd, "when you mix these things together, they react. But you have to get the proportions right. Too much of one thing, not enough of another, and it doesn't work properly." "Kind of like community policing," Sullivan found himself saying. "It's about finding the right balance, understanding all the elements at play." The volcano erupted in a spectacular display of red, blue, and green foam, drawing gasps and cheers from the audience. Sullivan caught Tamara's eye and saw her smile, the same knowing look she'd given him that day in Wilson's store, when she'd first challenged him to see beyond his assumptions. Later, as the event wound down, Sullivan gathered his family to leave. Katie was deep in conversation with Tamara about tutoring opportunities. Sarah was helping Tommy clean up his experiment, already planning improvements for next time. Chen approached him, holding out a folder. The commissioner saw the program numbers from this month. He wants to expand it to other precincts, wants you to help train officers in the new approach. Sullivan took the folder, thinking about how much had changed in just a few weeks, about how many lives had been touched, how many stories had been heard, how many bridges had been built. His radio crackled, another call, another situation waiting to be understood. But now, instead of tension, he felt hope. Because he knew that every call was an opportunity to build another bridge, to understand another story, to create another positive reaction in the ongoing experiment of community policing. "The badge is a bridge, not a barrier," he muttered to himself, touching the shield on his chest. "And bridges work both ways," Tamara added softly, passing by with Tommy. Sullivan watched them go, thinking about Marcus Washington, about Tamara's wisdom beyond her years, about Tommy's experiments and Marcus's dancing, and Angela's translation work, about how change really does happen one heart at a time, one story at a time, one bridge at a time. And he knew that while this chapter of understanding might be ending, the real work, the daily choice to see beyond assumptions, to hear every story, to build every possible bridge, was just beginning. As he headed toward his patrol car, Sullivan smiled. There would be more calls, more situations, more stories to understand. But now he had something he hadn't had before, the knowledge that behind every face was a story, behind every action was a context, and between every divide was the potential for a bridge. The rain had started again, just like that day at Wilson's store, but this time it felt less like an ending and more like a beginning. Each drop another small change in the ongoing experiment of understanding, each ripple a reminder that no bridge is ever truly finished being built.